Welcome to the Misophonia podcast. This is season 4, episode 13. My name is Adil Ahmad, and I have Misophonia. I'm so glad you're listening to this episode because it's an epic one. This week I'm talking to Dr. Jane Gregory, a clinical psychologist and misophonia researcher at Oxford University. I've had a few researchers and providers on the podcast before, but this is the first one who also has misophonia. You can read all about her and her work at her new website, soundsLikeMisophonia.com, as well as her Instagram and Twitter at soundsLikeMisophonia. All this will be linked from the show notes too. We go over so many things in this almost 90-minute episode, including therapies she uses in her practice to deal with misophonia, how she approaches navigating in the workplace, and the research she is conducting at the Department of Experimental Psychology at Oxford. Part of her work centers around the S5 questionnaire to measure misophonia, and we actually go over my results from the questionnaire, and I'll have the link to my chart in the show notes, as well as in the social media posts if you want to follow along our conversation. Okay, I want to get to this conversation ASAP, but I also want to remind you, if you want to jump into the conversation, feel free to leave a comment on social media at Misophonia Podcast on Instagram and Facebook, or Twitter at Misophonia Show. Or you can send me a message at misophoniapodcast.com. All right, now let's get to my conversation with Jane. Dr. Jane Gregory, welcome to the podcast. It's really good to have you here. I've been looking forward to this.
Thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
So, this is going to be an interesting, kind of a unique episode. We're going to talk about some results of a questionnaire. I'll leave some surprise there. But first, do you want to kind of tell us kind of where you're located?
Yeah, hi. I'm in Oxford, and I am doing a research fellowship at the University of Oxford. And also, I'm a clinical psychologist and work in the NHS, also with misophonia, so treating misophonia in Oxford. And yeah, based in Oxford. Sorry, I just realized I just said Oxford like 5 times. As soon as you start at the University of Oxford, it's like you're mandated to mention multiple times that's where you are. It's
Actually, is that true? Do they really want you to do a little bit of marketing for Oxford? Or,
they don't tell you to. It's just
okay.
I just can't quite believe that it's here that I'm doing this research, because I tried so hard to get funding, and so for the place that finally gave me funding to be Oxford is insane. And so I just can't help. It's just spews out of my mouth every time I talk about it.
It's fantastic. And I want to get into more about how all that came about a little later. And we should also mention that you do have misophonia. It's not like you're just a researcher or a provider of services. You actually have misophonia yourself.
That's right. Yeah. Like many therapists, I'm particularly drawn to something that will maybe solve a problem for myself.
I love that selfishness. I'm the same way. And trust me, this, as you know, this won't just help you, a lot of people, all the listeners here. So I guess, so Jane, earlier since the time that you scheduled the interview, you sent me a questionnaire, and I believe you have the results, which we'll discuss. I barely looked at the results, so I'm very interested to hear how that all came up. Do you want to maybe give some background on this questionnaire that you have?
Sure. Yeah. So this is it's called the S5 questionnaire, which is the Selective Sound Sensitivity Syndrome Scale, which is quite a mouthful. I don't know if people listening know that misophonia is also known as Selective Sound Sensitivity Syndrome.
I remember that name from, but continue,
Yeah, so the early days, Marsha Johnson, I think, was the one who coined that term. And obviously misophonia is less of a mouthful to say, so I guess that's taken off. But this questionnaire is a scale designed to measure misophonia. And this project was started by my collaborator, Celia Vittoratu, who is a statistician in psychometrics at the Institute of Psychiatry, Psychology and Neuroscience, IOPPN, at King's College London. And when I was sort of transitioning to try and do some work as a therapist and researcher on misophonia, I stumbled across her work. She had just started designing this questionnaire, and she'd done one big lot of collection of information from people with misophonia, and I joined the project at that stage, and I'd already started seeing patients at that stage as well, so I was able to contribute based on what my patients were telling me about misophonia, as well as obviously my own experience. So
Right.
we did we joined forces basically, and so with her statistics and psychometrics knowledge, and psychometrics just means measuring of psychological concepts, or concepts that can't be directly observed. And so it's designing questionnaires that capture these ideas and then using statistics to check whether it reliably measures what it is that it's meant to measure. So we've been through 3 huge rounds of data collection for this. It's been over 2,000 people that we've surveyed with misophonia, as well as.
And these are all local people in the UK?
No, so the misophonia sample came from, we promoted it on social media, so it's predominantly English-speaking countries, mostly UK, US, and some from Canada and Australia, and a few scattered around the world, but those are the main places they've come from. So yeah, that the misophonia sample is from everywhere, and each time we collected a round of data, we got feedback from people, as well as using the statistics side of things to work out which questions best captured the experience of misophonia. And we were really, really interested in it being more than just anger in response to sounds or disgust in response to sounds. We wanted to know what it felt like to have misophonia. And so the more that we spoke to people and tested out these questions, the sort of profile, a picture of misophonia started to emerge from the data that we had. It was really exciting.
Yeah, and then is eventually the goal is to be a way to diagnose people, because there seems to be some people are confused as to like what scale to use, and it doesn't seem to be maybe a something that people can one survey that people can fill out to figure out if they're likely to have misophonia. Is this kind of the goal, or is it more part of just collecting data for potential treatments? Maybe all of the
hoping it will
above.
do all of those things. So our main interest was 2 things. One, for it to be able to measure for research purposes, so that we could compare different aspects of misophonia and people with and without misophonia, and we could look at things in comparison to the severity of misophonia. So we needed something that changed with the severity of misophonia, and my goal as a clinical psychologist was to find something that could capture if people were improving during therapy. So I wanted something that would help to sort of show a picture of what their misophonia was like, help us to tailor their treatment program, sort of might bring up some things that I might not think to ask about, and then we could work together to plan the therapy, and then we can actually see if it is changing throughout the therapy. And what we noticed with the questionnaires that already existed that hadn't been through the rigorous statistical process that you need to go through to trust that a questionnaire measures what it's supposed to measure. So with those questionnaires, when I was giving those to my early patients, they were saying that it didn't quite capture the change. So it sort of initially captured the severity of their misophonia, but as they made changes, there were lots of things that were staying the same. And they said, but I feel so much better. So for example, one of them was, compared to other people, I am sensitive to the sound of X, eating or breathing or whatever. And they said, well, yes, compared to other people, that is 100% true. I am more sensitive, but I don't explode with anger anymore. And actually I can deal with it now. And that they still answered the top score on that question, but felt like things had hugely improved. So what we did was we split it into 2 parts, which one part was the reaction, and we looked at what type of emotion people experienced when they heard sounds. So not just does it bother you or not, but do you get angry? Do you feel panic? Do you feel disgust? Do you feel irritated? And ideally what we were trying to move from is from anger or disgust or panic down to irritation, so that we thought that would be a good outcome if a noise irritated you, but you could deal with it, that would still be okay. We weren't expecting a cure for misophonia. So that was one part of it. And then the other part was all of the sort of felt sense things that go with misophonia, what it's like to have misophonia. And that's the main part of the questionnaire now, because that was so powerful to see what that was like. I've now forgotten what your original question was, but
no, I think that totally covers it. I forgot as well. But
the
yeah,
purpose.
before we
Yes, you were asking about the purpose of the questionnaire.
Right.
So yes, research and treatment, but also what we're doing now is we're doing some clinical interviews with people with and without misophonia, where the interviewer doesn't know whether they have or don't have misophonia, and so they give a diagnosis through a clinical interview, which is how we would diagnose it in a therapy setting.
Yeah.
And then we match that. So we do a big group of that, and we match that to their scores on the S5. And then we see, using, again, silly as fancy statistics, we can then see whether there's a cutoff score that says, after above this score, you probably have maybe mild misophonia, and above this score, you have misophonia to the point where it's significantly impacting on your life and mood and relationships and things like that.
Right. So before we maybe take a look at a little bit about my results and see, how likely I am to punch someone in the face, maybe I'd be curious, like what are some of the treatments that you then do with patients to try to get them down to the irritation level?
Mm-hmm. So the main treatment that I use is called cognitive behavior therapy, CBT.
Mm-hmm.
And the main goal of CBT is to look at where the sort of felt sense of what's going on, almost like what your body is telling you is happening, if that doesn't match up with what you know rationally to be true, or what other people around you tell you rationally is true, if there's a mismatch there, and that's causing distress or anxiety or depression or anger, then we want to try and resolve that in some way. And that felt sense comes from typically our past experiences. So if you've had an experience, say, of being bullied as a kid, then you might be more likely to perceive something as criticism as an adult than somebody who wasn't bullied as a kid, as an example. So what we're trying to do in the therapy is work out what it feels like in the moment that this is a problem, and then try and almost rewrite those experiences to create new experiences that compete with the early experiences. I'm completely, I've just gone off completely on this, so sorry.
This is good.
This is really abstract. So like a common example, so one that something that works really well with CBT is social anxiety disorder. With social anxiety, people have a fear that they will do or say something to humiliate themselves, or they will appear so nervous and anxious that will be humiliating. And what we know is that for people with social anxiety, most of them don't actually have a social skills problem. They're not bad at socializing. They just might have had an experience, and it might even just be one key experience where things went badly socially and they did feel humiliated, or they were humiliated by somebody else, and they've kind of stored that. And when they're in a social situation, it's like their body tells them, remember what happened, that could happen again, you're in danger. And then they start to do things to try and protect themselves from danger happening, from humiliating themselves. But what ends up happening, all of those things that you do, so that's the behavior part of CBT, what you do sometimes makes the situation worse. So for example, if someone goes really red, so you can't see me right now, but my neck and chest is completely flushed red, because when I'm nervous about anything, that's what happens. So what somebody might do, if they think, everyone's going to see that I'm red, they're going to know that I'm nervous, they're going to think that I'm incompetent. So what they might do is wear a sweater or something that tries to cover it. And what happens to me if I do that is that the red just sort of claws its way out of the sweater and onto my face instead. So
right, you're warmer.
Exactly. Yeah. So some of those strategies actually make the problem that you're trying to prevent, sometimes it actually causes the problem you're trying to prevent. And sometimes it just reinforces the idea that you're in danger in the first place when you might not have been. So with misophonia, we're looking at things like, well, actually, maybe we can talk about the questionnaire, because the things that we capture in the questionnaire are the sorts of things that we think might be able to shift with
Yeah,
CBT.
let's talk about the questionnaire. I do want to come back eventually to like because I've talked to people recently who've in their childhood were diagnosed with social anxiety and OCD, and so it was all kind of mixed in with me. So I'd like
Hmm.
to come back to like what made you what would you tell people who therapists or people who think that it's all maybe kind of related and like what makes misophonia unique. But let's start. Yeah, so let's jump into the questionnaire first.
Yeah. So I'll start just by talking about the general population. So what we did after
Mhm.
we'd first did this completely just with people with misophonia to really get a sense of what it was like for those people.
Right. So global sample
Yep.
of people with misophonia. Yeah.
Yeah. And then what we did
And
was
these were I don't mean to cut you off again, but these were
Mhm.
self-identified people
Yes.
okay. Yeah.
Yeah. Absolutely. And so then what we did, we did the statistical analysis on that group, and that what the analysis, it's called factor analysis, and what that means is the statistics tells you which questions are statistically the best to represent the concept that you're trying to capture by the questionnaire, and it groups them together, and groups emerge to tell you, okay, how many different components are there of this broad problem? So with misophonia, if misophonia is the broad problem that we're trying to capture with the questionnaire, we ran the factor analysis, and this brought up 5 factors, and each factor had 5 questions that really clustered nicely together. So that just means that if someone answered yes, 10 out of 10, I feel trapped when I can't get away from sounds, then they're more likely to also say yes, 10 out of 10, I feel helpless when I can't get away from sounds. So that's clustering together. So we found 5 factors, and each factor very neatly had 5 questions. So each item was out of 10, each factor is out of 50, and then the total score is out of 250. So then we took that whole thing and gave it to a general population sample, which we used a service to do that, where they collect a group of people that are meant to represent the UK population. So in terms of age, gender, and ethnicity. So you can say that this sample of 771 people roughly represents the UK population in terms of age, gender, and ethnicity. And so then we gave the questionnaire to them, and then we reran all of the statistics just to check that it came up with the same pattern, the same things clustered together in that factor analysis. And then we were able to compare the scores on each factor and overall on the general population compared with the misophonia population. So I'll talk you through the general population first.
Yeah.
So the 5 factors that came out of this, the one that was highest in the general population was what we called externalizing. And this is a feeling that, you know what, it's not strange to get angry about the noises other people make because they're being rude, that people are being disrespectful and thoughtless with the sounds that they make, and they just shouldn't make that noise. Even if they don't know about misophonia, they just shouldn't be making those noises. So in the general population, that was a score of nearly 20 out of 50. So that was the highest for the general population.
Yep.
And then we have this was a factor called threat, and for the general population this was around 15 out of 50, so not particularly high for the general population. And this is that sense of feeling trapped, helpless, like you might panic or explode if you can't get away from sounds. And so understandably, for people in the general population, most people don't feel like that's a problem with sounds. And then we've got cluster of things. So it's that maybe I'm a bad person underneath. Maybe I'm just really angry deep down. I don't really respect myself when I'm reacting to sound. So there's a real sense of feeling like this is my fault. There's something wrong with me. I'm sort of broken or damaged in some way. And that was really low for people in the general population. Most people didn't think that there was anything wrong with them about the way they reacted to sounds, which is understandable because generally they're not reacting to sounds. And then we've got outburst, which is worrying that you might verbally or physically be aggressive, or in some cases actually be physically aggressive, or shouting, that kind of thing. And again, that was quite low in the general population. We're looking at like around 6 out of 10 for that one. And impact is the final one, which is not doing things that you would like to be able to do, or not seeing people that you would like to be able to see because of the sounds that you might come across if you do that. And again, of course, that was quite low for people in the general population, which the general population did include some people with misophonia, which this is meant to represent. If you just take a random sample of the general population, obviously some people will also have misophonia, but that score was around 5 out of 50 for impact. So that's the general population. And then if we compare that to the misophonia population, so if we go with externalizing, which was the highest factor in the general population, it was about 50% higher again in the misophonia population. So it went from around 20 to just over 30 in the misophonia population. So understandably, that would be higher in the misophonia population. But it's when we look at the other 4 factors that things start to get really interesting. So the threat factor, I feel helpless, I feel distressed, I feel trapped, or like I might panic or explode. The average score for that in the misophonia population was 45 out of 50, which means that for those 5 questions, on average, people scored 9 out of 10 for all 5.
Yeah, understandable. I mean, that's kind of the classic, that's the classic feeling of it for us. So interesting.
Yeah. So that really, really highlighted that a huge problem for people with misophonia is that sense of emotional threat of what will happen to them emotionally, what they will experience emotionally if they can't get away from sounds. And they're pretty extreme things. So feeling panic, feeling like you might explode, feeling trapped, feeling helpless. So that was the highest one for the misophonia population, 45 out of 50. And that was more than 3 times higher in the misophonia population than in the general population. And the other 3 factors, internalizing, outburst, and impact, were also 3 to 4 times higher in the misophonia population. So that tendency to blame yourself, to feel like there's something wrong with you for reacting this way, not doing the things that you'd like to be doing or seeing the people you'd like to be seeing, and either having sort of verbal or physical outbursts, or fearing that you might have outbursts. And I should say on that one, the physical outbursts, that was the lowest question of all the questions. So most people aren't physically aggressive. People were more likely to say that they were verbally aggressive or shouting at people, or that they were afraid that they would do that. But most people were not physically aggressive as a result of
Yeah, again, this
misophonia.
also tracks kind of the anecdotal kind of anecdotal evidence basically is that everyone seems to claim, no one has the thoughts, but then few people have actually acted out, at least physically.
Yeah, and that fear that you might do that can also, I was talking earlier about within CBT, that often what feels true in the moment can come from our past experiences. So I know for me, I went through a long period of time where I thought I was going to snap, but that's because when I was 10 years old, I snatched a donut out of my brother's hand because he wouldn't eat with his mouth closed.
You monster.
I know, I was an awful 10-year-old. And so in my head, or not even in my head, in my whole body, it was like I could physically feel like that's what I might do if I don't get away from this sound, that I might snap in that way again.
Oh, do you often remember that moment when you go through these rages, or is it just something as part of therapy you've remembered and just kind of make that connection at an abstract level?
Yeah, so it was sort of something that because I'll talk a little bit about the CBT later, but one of the things that we do is to try and almost travel back to those early experiences, just so that we can almost to validate where that feeling comes from. And so that I like to experiment on myself with this stuff, just to see what's happening and to make sure that I'm not making people do things that aren't too traumatic. So I just sort of try everything out on myself first.
Right.
And it very quickly took me back to that memory. I could picture it. It was in a hotel room. It was the first time we had one of those buffet breakfasts. And so it was one of these moments where it should have been amazing. Like, we're all so excited to have this unlimited treats for breakfast. And my brother was standing right next to me, chewing with his mouth, and I just ripped it out of his hand and threw it in the bin. And when you're a kid, it's really, really hard to contain your emotions. We just don't have the skills yet to control that kind of emotion. But of course, as an adult, by then we've usually learned skills to be able to contain ourselves. But it doesn't change the feeling that I might still be capable of it.
Do you feel a little bit of? I will get back to all this, but do you?
Mhm.
I was curious. Do you feel a little bit of? I don't know. I know it was a small moment, but did you feel a little bit of guilt out of that, or shame out of having done that? Like, was there?
Yeah.
Did your parents kind of be like, "What the?" Just
Well,
curious.
the funny thing is, I can't remember how my parents reacted. I definitely I still feel guilty and ashamed of it.
Mhm.
I've processed that, so it doesn't haunt me in the same way anymore. But yeah, I felt awful about it. And the key thing for me was that it was so contradictory to what I was usually like as a person. I was this pretty calm, obedient kid. I was, really cared about people's feelings. I was, did well at school and got along with my friends and got along with my siblings. And so it was so out of character for me. That's one of the things I think that scared me the most. And that's what I'm noticing talking to lots of patients as well, is that sometimes it's not that you feel like it's a true reflection of yourself. Sometimes what feels so awful is that it's a massive conflict to who you usually are as a person. And the same in the externalizing realm, thinking about other people doing this to us, that it feels so out of character for someone who is usually so caring and respectful and loving towards us to do something that can make us so distressed. So it feels like,
Yeah, it's kind of like you scare yourself, not just the sounds that are giving you that fear.
yeah, absolutely.
Interesting. Yeah, we'll dive into that maybe a little bit more later. But
Hmm.
I think do you want to get back to maybe the results here? I think we were on. I think we gone through externalizing and threat and outburst for the misophonia population. I think there's
Yes. And then internalizing an impact was similar
yeah,
to outburst in that it was 3 or 4 times higher than in the general population.
yeah,
So the difference between externalizing and internalizing in the misophonia group is not that big, but in the general population, externalizing is much higher than internalizing. So people with misophonia are much more likely to blame themselves for this than people in the general population who react to sounds, who are more likely to just say, that person's just being disgusting. That's on them, not on me.
right. Gotcha. Okay. Yeah. No. Really interesting, and obviously the listeners will have this to look at as they're listening. There's then there's one line left, and that's
Mm-hmm.
the yellow one here, um, which it's interesting. Obviously, three or four of them track exactly, and then there's one outlier, which I don't know what that says about me, but we'll talk about maybe what that means. So, um, do you want to talk a little bit about how my results were similar
Yeah,
or different?
absolutely. Yeah. So as you say, so externalizing, impact, outburst, and threat all almost exactly
Yeah.
match
Amazing.
the general
Yeah.
not the general population, the misophonia population. So really,
Right.
really similar. Within, I would say, each of them is within 2 points of
Mm-hmm.
the misophonia population. So you are tracking very neatly with our average misophone there. But the one that is non-existent for you is internalizing. So do you want to tell me a bit about that in a non-therapy kind of way?
Yeah. So, I mean, from what I understand for that, I don't know what you called it, a feature or whatever. So the internalizing is blaming yourself, I think, for
That's right.
the issue. Yeah. So I don't know if I should also take some kind of a narcissism test, but it seems like I basically don't take any blame for the situation that I'm in, and does that mean that I've shifted everything to the externalizing side? Because it looks like my externalizing even is higher a little bit than the misophonia population. I'm
Do
just
you
trying to look at it now in the questionnaire to see which of those questions might I dislike. So I remember doing the questionnaire, and there were questions like I dislike myself in the moments of my reactions to sounds,
yeah.
and I think, I mean, I definitely, I don't remember what I wrote, but I probably would have said not, pretty much not at all true, because I think what I was thinking when I answered that was like, I mean, at least I realized that it's a temporary situation, and so I don't dislike myself as a whole. maybe I obviously dislike the reaction. I don't like to be in that. I don't like to have that feeling, but I certainly don't dislike myself. Was that one of the internalizing questions?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Okay. Okay.
I dislike myself. I respect myself less because of the way I
Yeah,
react
that
to
one too.
sounds.
I'm pretty sure I said pretty much not at all true, and that's obviously what the graph says.
Yeah, you've got,
Um,
I think, 0 for all of those. So
yeah.
either either you've done a lot of work on not blaming yourself for this, or so one of the things that I've tried to
Maybe
this
that's just from being work from home for so long, is that I'm only around pretty much myself.
and you're
So
talking
I
to a
have to
lot of
like
other people
myself.
with misophonia, so
Right.
it's
Right.
become more normal to you. But actually, this is the internalizing factor is typically the first thing that I try to work on with people in therapy, because if you're blaming yourself, if you're feeling shame or guilt for how you react to sounds, it's really hard to do any other work on misophonia, because it feels so awful to feel like there's something wrong with you deep down that it's really hard to make changes. So I would be aiming to get this, maybe not everyone would get down to 0 completely, but I'd be aiming to get this down below all the other factors before doing any other
And that's really
work in
interesting because
therapy.
I mean, I did ask you a couple minutes ago about how did you feel about shame and guilt, and that is something that comes up a lot on the in these interviews, and so it's very top of mind for me. So it probably is something that I'm kind of processing, and I think a lot of people should. So I'm glad that you guys are identifying that as an important first step, first factor to try to minimize. That's very
Yeah.
cool.
Yeah, and I think especially because something with misophonia, we don't actually have a cure for it. We don't really understand the sensory kind of perception aspect of it yet. And so we can't take the reaction away completely, but what we can do is, like, at the very least, make people feel better about themselves for reacting. And then, we'll talk a bit more about the other aspects of therapy, but we're not trying to take misophonia away. We're just trying to make misophonia feel less awful. And anytime there's shame, I mean, shame is an emotion that's there to tell you you are not a good enough person to be accepted by other people. And so if you're stuck in that thing, in that state, it feels really desperate. It feels really hopeless, and it's really hard to do anything else to change if you're feeling that way.
Right, and that probably has all kinds of like a domino effect with other issues, probably self-esteem and probably other anxieties and other things.
Yeah. The thing I like to compare this one to is, so for kids with dyslexia or dyspraxia going through school and struggling to achieve at school because of dyslexia or dyspraxia, and feeling like they are stupid or they are lazy or they are badly behaved or whatever. If you blame yourself for that, then that is going to affect your self-esteem. And for kids who weren't given a diagnosis of dyslexia at school, then it makes a lot of sense that they would feel stupid or lazy, because it doesn't make sense otherwise. Without the diagnosis, it doesn't make sense that you can't do things as easily or as quickly as your peers, or that you find some things really, really hard and other things really, really easy. It makes it look like you just don't want to do the other things. And so for people who've had that experience growing up as adults, they might now know, oh, I have dyslexia. That's all it is. Not that, dyslexia can be a real problem, but it's not the dyslexia diagnosis on its own isn't the biggest problem. It's the impact of having dyslexia and either not knowing it or being treated badly because of it, being treated as though there is something wrong
else,
with you.
or
And not having the accommodations you need.
Did you were there? You said there were kind of a wide age group here. Did you get many children as part of this sample?
No, this one we just did 18 plus. So this is just adults. Yeah, the questions weren't quite, well, we haven't tested them on children or adolescents. So I know that there's a team at Sussex who are trying to create a measure for children and adolescents. And there's just some slightly different ways of measuring things for kids. So this one at this stage, I've used it with a couple of sort of late teens kind of ages people, and it works pretty well with them because they can sort of answer these questions on their own, but they might not. It hasn't been tested on younger people.
Yeah, I'm hoping in the future it's totally normal. Like there is a dyslexia test, as you mentioned, for kids, that there should be a misophonia test for kids who are, coming up and being very distracted and having this affect their grades. I feel like it's probably being so unidentified in schools, and then affecting people's lives in a very negative way.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely. I think that research is very much needed, is to look at the impact that it has on attention and learning and things like that in school, because sometimes just some really simple accommodations can make a huge difference for kids with misophonia.
Absolutely. Did you want to talk now a little bit more about some of the therapies that are being used in your practice or in your group?
Yeah, sure. So we have now two specialist psychology services in the UK. So one based at the Maudsley Hospital in London, and one based at the Oxford. Oh God, it's another one of those mouthful names. Oxford Health Specialist Psychological Intervention Centre. So both of them now, we take referrals from all over the country for people with misophonia. The one in London is just for adults. The one in Oxford is for children, adolescents, and adults. So we can take referrals through the NHS, which means that it's free at the point of delivery for the patient. And again, so talking about CBT before, so we're using CBT, but it's very much tailored to the individual. So what we're doing is we're using this questionnaire. We're doing a nice long assessment appointment with the person and trying to map out their individual picture of misophonia. So what's happening in the moment when you're reacting to sounds? What does it feel like is happening? What does it feel like it means about you? What does it feel like it means about the other person? And if someone just came and said, and so this is where I'm at now with my misophonia, is that I don't like the sounds, but it doesn't make me angry anymore. It doesn't make me anxious or panic. I don't really think about sounds when they're not happening. So I consider myself to have very mild misophonia. So if I'm sitting at the dinner table and someone's making a lot of noise, I'll just do the subtle finger in the ear or put some music on or something, and I can deal with it. And if I'm trying to work, I keep earplugs in various locations around my home. And so if I need to focus on something and there's a sound that bothers me, I'll just pop earplugs in. But I try not to use earplugs unless there is a sound that is stopping me from doing something. So I can deal with sounds if they're not stopping me from doing something. So what we're trying to capture in this at the very start of therapy is checking whether therapy is actually appropriate. So there needs to be some kind of psychological component to their misophonia for a psychological treatment to be useful. And if there isn't, then obviously therapy is not really the right place for them. So it could be some of the things that we've talked about what feels like is happening in the moment, and maybe that's linked to past experiences, or it could just be that this is causing a lot of stress in the home, or it could be that they're waiting for sounds to happen. So people often describe feeling anxious because they think a sound is going to happen, especially if there's sounds from neighbors and things like that. So they might be like just on edge all the time. So if the sounds are affecting you when they're not even happening, then there's work that we can do.
It's a whole other level
in therapy. Yeah. And same with after the event. So one of the things that I'm trying to look at in my research is whether after the trigger is over and there's no sound there anymore, do people replay the event? Do they think about their reactions? Do they think about the other person and how dare they? Or do they think about, what's wrong with me that I react this way, and feel really guilty or ashamed? And again, if that's continuing to impact you once the sound has stopped, then that's where psychological treatment might be helpful. So what we're trying to do with therapy is sort of look at these early experiences, and I've taken strategies that we use for post-traumatic stress disorder, but that also gets used now for social anxiety, obsessive compulsive disorder, body dysmorphic disorder, where past events influence how you feel in the present day, and we sort of go back and kind of update those memories with a new perspective based on what we know now. So with misophonia, one of the key things is that most of the people who are coming to therapy now are adults, and because misophonia is only very newly recognized, and even now I think in the general population study, I think only 13% of people had even heard of misophonia. So there are
I would say barely recognized, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And that also unfortunately includes health professionals who don't recognize it, and teachers and other key people in our lives. And so for a lot of people coming to therapy now, they had these reactions as a kid but didn't know what it was. And so that then shapes what it feels like it means in the moment. So if as a kid you thought everyone heard sounds like this, and therefore why would anyone do this to me, you must know how much this annoys me because it would annoy you just as much, then you're more likely to be in that externalizing category of like, you're doing this to me. And sometimes if people have had, say, siblings that used to torment them with sounds, then they might also feel now like you're doing this deliberately to torment me. And that's not to say that sometimes people aren't doing that, because I have also heard people being tormented by family members, partners, friends.
I've definitely heard that too. Yeah.
Even health professionals, again, devastatingly, sometimes a doctor might say, "Oh, you mean like this," and then make the noise.
Yeah.
No, I don't mean like exposure. I mean just like
okay.
The person describes what they get angry at, and then the health professional makes the noise and says, "Oh, is this what you mean?" So if that was your experience growing up, then you're more likely to feel that way currently. And so what we do with post-traumatic stress disorder is if you take a memory like that that's kind of frozen in time, and ordinarily when we go through an unpleasant or scary or upsetting event, when we remember it the next time, each time we remember it, we update it a little bit with what we now know, or with perspectives of ours that have changed since then. So I was talking about bullying before. So when the bullying is happening, in that moment, you might feel afraid, for example. But then later that day, you remember it again. And because you now know that, okay, you're safe now, it didn't result in you being put in the hospital or whatever it was that it felt like was going to happen at the time. But now you feel humiliated because everyone knows about it. And so the memory is the same. It's the same content, but the emotion changes. And then 5 years later, you might think back and feel really angry at the bully and think, oh, how dare you do that? That was really uncalled for. So the focus is sort of less on you and more on the bully. And then as an adult, you might look back at that and remember it, and you might actually start to feel compassion, either for yourself or even for the bully, because you think, well, actually now as an adult, I'm aware that most bullying behavior doesn't come out of nowhere, that most kids who are bullies have got some stuff going on for them that means that they take it out on other kids. And so you're not, it's not like rewriting the memory itself, it's updating it with what you've learned since then. So with misophonia, if you had an experience where you're sitting at the table and you can't figure out why this is bothering you so much, and you're thinking, what's wrong with me? There's something wrong with me that I'm reacting this way and no one else is bothered by it, and you're feeling really embarrassed or ashamed by that. If that continues to feel this way as an adult, then what we would do is we would bring that back to the surface and almost like talk to that younger child and just say, okay, what do you want to explain to yourself that you didn't know at the time, that you really needed to know at the time? And so it's just kind of like doing that process that our memories normally do automatically. We're just manufacturing that process of updating it with the information that we have, or the perspectives that we have now. So it's a sort of talking to your younger self saying, okay, you've got this thing called misophonia, and 1 in 5 people are affected by noises like this, some people more than others, and there's nothing broken or wrong with you. It's just that you can't filter out these kinds of sounds, and it feels really intense right now because you don't feel like you can get away from this sound. Or maybe you literally can't get away from this sound, but you're going to be okay. That, at one point someone else will understand, and at another point someone will be there to help you. And then we take whatever it is that you've sort of updated that early memory with and bring it and sort of give that to yourself as an adult as well, just sort of like to have in moments where you just sort of say, okay, this is misophonia, I'm not broken, this feels so intense because I went through those awful experiences as a kid, but I now know what it is. And what we hope with that is it's not going to take the reaction away completely, but it brings the reaction down a tiny bit because you take away the shame. You take away the guilt.
That's a big component. Yeah.
And so that's typically like that's the sort of like the early stages of treatment to make sure that you've sort of addressed any stuck memories that are almost like telling your body how to feel in that moment.
Right. So all that work is basically for that internalizing factor. It seems like,
or it could be externalizing, and it could also be threat.
Yeah.
Because if as a kid, like you were stuck at the dinner table, for example, because you would have got told off or humiliated if you started crying or something like that, then it might be like, your parents don't get it. They're telling you to stay here because they don't understand how bad this is for you. That's why you're stuck here right now. But when you get older, you'll be able to control your environment more. You won't have to stay in places that are this distressing for you, and you might find people who are more understanding of this, or you'll be able to communicate it better or something like that. So that can also bring down the sense of threat if those early experiences are contributing to that feeling.
Yeah, we talk about that a lot, how as you get older, you have more control over your environment. But of course, we just say that in the course of an interview. I'm curious, like, how long do these treatments typically take for your patients? Like, to like if somebody's listening and they're like, okay, this sounds good, like, but I'm curious, like how long this would kind of take. I'm sure at some point it's like a lifelong process, obviously. But curious, kind of like, when do you start seeing results, and are there other phases beyond what you described already?
Yeah, absolutely. So yes, there are other phases. I can talk about that in a second. So in terms of the total course of treatment, for most, I just finished a case series. So a case series is just when you collect a group of people who have been through the same treatment for the same problem, and you pull together all of the data from questionnaires and things like that, and you look at the sort of pattern of change for a group of people. And so for them, that we had 19 people, and the number of sessions was between 12 and 16, I think. So 12 to 16 hours of cognitive behavior therapy, and that was most people at the point that they stopped. They were ready to stop. They were like, I've got this from now, which is where you want to get to with CBT, is like, I can keep going with this on my own. So so 12 to 16 hours.
Gotcha. Okay, interesting. And that's not long at all. I was thinking like months and years maybe to finally
absolutely. For some people it might be longer, especially if you have if there are things in addition to misophonia that make your misophonia a lot worse. So maybe not really knowing how to contain your own emotions, or sort of feeling like your emotions get out of control, or not having a very supportive environment, or having a really noisy environment, then those sorts of things can make it take longer.
Right.
Especially the noisy environment. Like if you're, this case series was done in London, and so lots of people there live in flats, and the biggest challenge is noisy neighbours. Can make
got it. So they're doing their treatment, but it's a constant onslaught. And so it's kind of hard to focus on the treatment because you're always reverting back, probably, or often reverting back.
Yeah, and you just don't get a break. You don't get a break from it, and that's one of the key things in treatment is making sure at some point, if you can, getting a sensory break every day, because your whole nervous system just needs to reset. And so that might mean having to leave the house if there's constant noise in the home, or it might mean building yourself a little cocoon in your home and putting nice music on or something like that, but just giving your body that sort of reset of the nervous system.
Are you able to give people some kind of letter of accommodations or something, like if they're at work and it's really noisy, that they can kind of get out during treatment? Or
yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And typically, so sometimes it might be just some immediate things that, if there are small, one of the things I say is for accommodations, I say if there's a small thing that makes a big difference, then that's worth fighting for. So for some people, it's just as simple as like their boss tells them they're not allowed to wear headphones at work because it looks rude. So I would definitely be helping them to fight for that. That's just ridiculous. If they don't have to be like available at all times to hear people, then that to me seems crazy, to compromise someone's mental health just for appearances.
Well, I usually say they're not just the individual's mental health, but the company's bottom line. If that person is not able to function, they're not contributing to the company.
Absolutely.
And so
yeah. And if people are asking how they can talk to their employer, that's how I would describe it, is like, I will be more productive if I can't hear these sounds.
I will make you more money.
Yeah.
Bottom line.
Yeah. I had to do that when I was working in the NHS. I mean, one of my jobs in the NHS was I had to have people come and ask, like, talk me through patients they were seeing, and I had to help them decide whether they were suitable for treatment or whether they needed to do a risk assessment or whatever. And often people would come up while they were eating, and I had to just say, I'm really sorry, but I have trouble concentrating when I can hear eating. Do you mind if we just pause this conversation, or you pause eating, and then I'll be able to give you my full attention? And that, sort of trying to, I talk about sort of trying to get people to focus on the outcome that they want. So yeah, I think it is a bit rude to come up and talk to someone with your mouth full, but what I need in that moment is to be able to do my job effectively. I don't need them to learn a lesson in manners. So that means me kind of taking responsibility. Oh, I've got this thing, and could you please help me out with it? And that will help me to help you better. So sort of focusing on what they get out of doing this thing for me.
No, it's a great tip. I think that can be generalized as people are trying to navigate this everywhere. People are often looking for, how do I broach the subject? Because that's the one thing that leads to people bottling this up, is that they don't know how the other person's going to react. What's the best thing to say? So that's a good way to kind of approach people about it.
Yeah, it's very much testing the waters on these things. But
that's true.
Anything that you can.
Well, a lot of people. So another thing that happens is a lot of people test the waters too much, kind of like early on, and then they get bitten so many times that actually later on they just start to kind of like revert to revert to not the best word, but just kind of like close themselves off more and more, which.
Yeah. And understandably, like, often what we try to do is fix the problem while it's happening. So whilst you're feeling panic or anger or disgust, it's really hard to ask someone to do something that they don't even realize is a problem, because you'll do it with anger and disgust and panic on your face and in your voice. And so that's the other key thing here, is like, don't use examples that haven't worked of times where you've been in the moment as evidence for whether or not people will understand, because often people won't understand if they're feeling defensive because they're feeling attacked, or feeling like you think that they are disgusting, or that you think that they have terrible manners, or whatever it is. So as much as possible, being careful with the planning of these conversations and doing it at times when you're not reacting to a sound.
Right. Do we go over kind of really quickly maybe some of the other phases that you treat people with?
Sure. Absolutely.
Following that first one.
Yep.
And then I want to definitely get into kind of your background too, but I'd be interested to hear that.
Yeah, absolutely. So as I said, so if it's appropriate, typically I'd be starting with that kind of memory stuff and updating that. And then what I'd usually be trying to do is to reclaim the time in between sounds. So if there is no sound happening, I want people to be living their life to the full there. And that's one to bring down that impact one, where there's that sort of sense that I can't live a normal life with misophonia. But if it's only the time when there are sounds, would that be better for you? If you all the time where there was no sound, if you could just live fully, how much of your life would you get back? And if the answer to that is a lot, then we would spend some time working out how to do that. So it might just be simply like planning to do things at times when there's no sound. It might be strategies for calming down after the sound is finished, and then sort of refocusing your attention back on what you were doing. It strategies like mindfulness type exercises where it's sort of like bringing your attention to the present moment, learning to be in charge of where your attention is, that kind of thing. So strategies like that can help you just to make sure that you are filling the time where there are no sounds with meaningful and enjoyable activities.
Right. So you're not on the edge all the time.
Exactly. Yeah. And so if you can get absorbed in something when there are no sounds, then that also serves as a reset so you can cope better with sounds. It often feels like you have to be on edge to prepare yourself for sounds, but often it might be a bit more of a jolt to start with when the sound comes out of nowhere because you're absorbed in something. But on balance, if you're filling your time with enjoyable, absorbing, productive things, and then you have to deal with sounds, you'll deal with the sounds much better because you'll feel productive and you'll feel relaxed.
Well, if you're doing something that's making you less stressed, what comes up all the time is stress is a major exacerbating factor. So yeah, I can totally see that where on the whole, doing something, absorbing yourself in something you enjoy doing will reduce stress. And then that jolt, hopefully the amplitude of that jolt won't be as high.
Yeah.
Because
absolutely.
all your muscles are not ready and clenched to attack.
And you'll absolutely, because if you're feeling more stressed, then that process in our brain that tells us, that for people with misophonia brains, it's like the brain is saying that sounds important, keep listening to that. And that's something that all brains have the capacity to do when there's potential danger. So someone without misophonia walking home at night can tune into the sound of footsteps behind them in case it's somebody following them home. Someone with misophonia might detect that sound during the day in broad daylight when there's absolutely no danger. But all brains have the capacity to do that. And we're more likely to do that when we're under stress. So that makes sense then that misophonia would be worse when you are more stressed or more anxious about things. So if you're waiting for sounds to happen, you are also more likely to detect sounds and to find it harder to filter them out.
So yeah, that reminds me of the brain question. So there's research and folks who are looking at whether this is whether it's genetic or just where some miswiring of the brain. What do you think about that debate or that part of the discussion versus it coming from PTSD-ish kind of situation?
Yeah, so basically what so thinking about Kumar's paper, The Brain Basis for Misophonia, one of the fascinating things about that was actually one of the key papers that got me interested in the psychology of it, because the part of the brain that had heightened activity in people with misophonia was the area that's called the salience network. And salience, that just means meaning. And so that's where that means that the brain is putting meaning on sounds that people with misophonia aren't putting on sounds. And meaning, that part of the brain, that salience network, that comes from our past experiences. So what that study was showing us is that it was a neurological representation of the sorts of things that I'm now working on in therapy. So that would also show up in somebody with obsessive compulsive disorder who puts meaning on thoughts that other people might not put meaning on, or on someone with panic disorder who puts meaning on their heart rate in a way that somebody without panic disorder might not do. So that part of the brain, so it looks, we put that in the neurological category because we can see it's part of the brain, it's part of the neural network, but it's actually representing something psychological.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah, it's interesting. So that kind of reinforced, inspired and also reinforced kind of your ideas about what's happening.
Yeah, absolutely.
And
so what I would be
it.
fascinated to find out if someone goes through therapy and the meaning behind the sound changes, whether that activity in that part of the brain actually reduces.
Yeah.
And one of the other things that I'm really curious about is that part that I was talking about before about where the brain, if you hear really rhythmic, repetitive sounds, typically after you hear it once or twice, your brain will just go, oh, that's rhythmic and repetitive. You don't need to keep listening to that. But for some reason, for people with misophonia, the brain never tells you stop listening to it. So you keep hearing things as long as they are going, you can keep hearing them in a way that someone without misophonia, their brain would not. It would just say, that's not important. You don't have to listen to that anymore. And so you just wouldn't hear
Sometimes
it.
we keep kind of hearing it or expecting it or waiting for it.
Not even necessarily waiting for it, like literally whether you hear it or not. So they do this amazing study where they play just two sounds really close together, and people with neurotypical brains, they only hear one sound because the brain just says those sounds are identical. There's nothing to be gained from continuing to listen to this sound. There's no danger. Whereas people with autism spectrum disorder or OCD or panic disorder, they will hear two sounds. And so the theory is that the brain doesn't tell those people not to hear it anymore. So they literally hear it when the other person doesn't.
Maybe that might be a good time. I know we're already like, and this is, I could go on forever. Everything's
I'm just delighted
here.
to have like a conversation just about misophonia. I think all my friends and family are bored of me talking about it.
Yeah. Oh God, no. Yeah, we might have to even do a part 2 at this point. This is so good. But I do want to also, I want to talk about Jane's background here with misophonia, and maybe kind of a few of my usual prompts. Like, when did you start noticing this happening for you? Was it just the donut incident, or did it go further back?
Yeah, I think so. The donut incident was the key, like, oh, this is a problem kind of incident.
Obviously life-changing. Yeah.
Yeah. But I do remember earlier than that, so probably around the age of 8 or something, there were just these pigeons that lived outside my window, and I couldn't concentrate at all when I could hear these pigeons. And so my family were just completely baffled that I would be like found in my room just crying because the pigeons wouldn't stop making this stupid pigeon noise. So that's like my first memory of a really repetitive noise stopping me from doing what I wanted to be able to do. And then throughout school, it was sort of on and off. I remember when we sort of switched from the old Walkman headphones, the ones that sort of went over your head with the little round things. Right. When it switched to the more earbud style, then it was like heaven for me, because I used to just hide them in underneath my school uniform, and I had long hair, so I would just put them in my ear. As soon as we weren't having to listen to the teacher, I would just pop those headphones in and just listen to music really, really quietly in class while I was working. And I just got so much more work done because suddenly I wasn't having to pay attention to all of the clicking pens and rustling and talking and chewing and stuff in class. So I sort of remember it affecting me on and off, and around exams, in particular at university, like the invigilators walking around and sort of the footsteps of that, and I could hear someone sniffing across the room and couldn't concentrate. So it was, it's like one of those things where I don't remember it being this constant problem in my life, but when I think back to it, I can pinpoint really specific moments where it had a real impact on what I was trying to do.
Right. So obviously, you heard it in exams. I always ask about that, but it certainly didn't seem to have dragged you down too far. Because
imagine where I'd be now if I hadn't had misophonia.
Yeah, that too. Hopefully, maybe prime minister rather than the current guy. But yeah, okay. So you got. What did your parents think? What did your family think as you were growing up? Did they take it seriously? Dismiss it?
They just didn't get it.
Baffled.
Yeah,
Okay. Yeah.
Just baffled. And my parents are pretty like responsive, warm parents, so they sort of could validate my distress without actually understanding what was going on. And so I probably
were they generally sympathetic to these kinds of issues in general? I've spoken to a few people from the UK, and it seemed like the culture is very much kind of bite your lip and carry on kind of thing.
I am actually from Australia, so we are a little bit. I mean, it's still it's not the stiff upper lip. It's just like, oh, come on, don't be soft. Right. It's sort of more so it's a similar outcome but different reason. Like, it makes you wrong. It's wrong for different reasons. But not in my family. That wasn't the case. We were quite relatively sort of emotional and warm family. So it wasn't like you couldn't talk about your feelings or anything like that. And I very much think that's one of the reasons why misophonia didn't affect me more than it did, because I felt a bit alone, but I didn't feel completely isolated. I didn't feel completely hopeless. It's just like, oh, when it bothered me, but it didn't sort of torment me the rest of the time.
Gotcha. Okay. And then obviously, I'm assuming it affected your career choice. Was it something that you knew early on that I want to do something about this. I want to learn about it. I want to work on something that'll treat other people.
Well, it's a good
Is that kind of where it
question.
came from?
Funnily enough,
Yeah.
like it had no bearing on my career choice in general. I was already
Mm-hmm.
working as a clinical psychologist when I actually heard the term misophonia. So, like a lot of people, there was this one key article in the New York Times that talked about it, and it started getting sent around. Like people go, "Oh, hang on, you get annoyed by sounds. This
I need to
sounds
get
like
her on the
you."
podcast. Like, yeah, I always hear about that article.
Yeah, and if you look at the search trends on Google for the term
Mm-hmm.
misophonia, the month that article came out, it just spikes. It's like there's almost no searches for misophonia, and then that article comes, and boom, searches go up. Probably like 50 times what it was
Yeah.
before. And there was another article published like 2 years later or something, and the same thing happened in the search trends. So basically, I found out through one of those articles, and at the time, even then, I wasn't really thinking about it in terms of career. It was just like, oh, thank goodness.
Right.
It's not
Kind of
just
like the
this
rest of
secret
us.
crazy.
Yeah.
I'm not just this uptight person. And so, yeah, it wasn't until it was about over 3 years ago now, I just started thinking about it a little bit more. And I was writing a blog at the time where I was sort of trying out CBT on myself. And so I was trying to just do little experiments that would sort of put me in situations that might mimic what my patients went through. So like I watched horror films on repeat and measured my heart rate to see what it was, to see the habituation process of sort of repeated exposure to a horror film. And I
Wow, that's interesting. It's a fun way to watch a horror movie.
oh yeah, Wolf Creek. It still haunts me. I watched it 5 times, and yeah, my heart rate did come down by the end.
I guess I can see what my Apple Watch is doing while I'm watching a movie.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Yeah, and I was working with OCD at the time, and with OCD, we often make people do things that make them feel contaminated. So I then licked to the bottom of. So in the UK, we call them welly boots. Do you call them gum boots? Maybe. What do you call like
familiar
rain boots that you would wear?
Yeah, rain boots.
Okay.
Yeah, rain boots.
So I was at a music festival, and so to replicate that process of feeling contaminated and then not being able to do anything to decontaminate, I licked the bottom of my welly boot, and then didn't do anything to decontaminate. So that's what I was doing at the time. That was my little experimental side project. And I thought, oh, why didn't I try this with misophonia? Because I sort of started to notice some similarities in what I was doing with misophonia about blocking the sounds and avoiding, and maybe just sort of trying to compensate for sounds that looked a little bit similar to what some of my patients with OCD were doing. And so I started looking into it and found that these 2 teams of researchers, one in Amsterdam and one in New York, were from an OCD background and were now working on misophonia, and they'd kind of fallen into misophonia. So I made some contact with some of the researchers and just started to think a little bit more about it. And then I was thinking, like, why aren't more therapists treating this? It seems like we could actually make a difference. And then I was thinking, oh, hang on, I'm a therapist. Why aren't I treating this?
Right. So you're busy, and why instead of licking my boots and watching horror movies.
Also, very important things to be doing. Right. Not exactly life-changing, though. So I put together a proposal for my boss at the time and just said, look, there's this thing, I kind of have it, and I kind of think we could make a difference. And just by sheer coincidence, we had 2 referrals for people with anxiety who also happened to have misophonia, and it turned out the misophonia was one of the key sources of their anxiety. So what I'd been working on just in my own time in secret was like adapting some of the therapy models that we use for anxiety disorders. I'd been adapting it for misophonia. Just at that stage, it was just based on my experiences. But then I started to build on it with my patients. So bringing in what they were experiencing and sort of really trying to flesh it out, and then looking into the research to see what people were reporting in the research, and started to build this model of understanding the sort of psychological components of misophonia, knowing that it's not going to be a cure, but that hopefully we could help people. And those early few patients did really well, and one of them was really skeptical. There's no way this has got anything to do with psychology. I'm only here to prove to myself that it doesn't work. And then she did really, really well with therapy. And of course, the misophonia doesn't go away completely, but all the people that came through at that stage, they were able to work without feeling anxious anymore. They were able to sort of live relatively normal lives, and but all their questionnaires around depression and anxiety all massively improved as well, not just misophonia. So
how did that track over time? Do you follow up with them?
With that group, no, because at the time I sort of collected it enough to I did it as what's called a service evaluation, where you only collect the data that you would normally collect for the purposes of therapy. So I hadn't set it up as research, so I couldn't do any extra things that you wouldn't normally do in therapy, because you need ethics approval to do that. So we at the service where I was at the time, we took questionnaire scores every week so that we could see change happening. And so it meant that we could see, when we did this one particular technique or experiment, scores went down a lot. Now let's just have a look at someone else, and did their scores go down after they did that particular technique as well? And so we could start to see what some of the key things were just from doing that. So then word got out that that's what we were doing there. So we started to get more referrals for misophonia, which meant that the treatment started to get better because I had more people to feed into it. And that was around the time that I joined forces with Cilia to do the S5 questionnaire. So then we started working on that at the same time, and that because we then had statistics to help us, we could learn more about sort of the average picture of misophonia as well. So that then helped with my therapy, and obviously having the questionnaire was going to help that as well. So it just kind of grew from there.
Yeah. So tell me maybe the current group, the makeup of where you are right now. And you said there's also a research group looking at kind of younger folks. Is that in the kind of the same offices as where you are at?
No, so that's a separate project. So there are a couple of people who have some. So presumably you know about the Misophonia Research Fund that was set up by the Ream Foundation.
Right.
So two of the funded projects from there are from the University of Sussex, and one of those is particularly looking at child and adolescents. So I'm in touch with them, but I'm not that we're not part of the same team. So my project, so basically once I started doing this in my day-to-day clinical role and a lot in my spare time, I started thinking, okay, I really need someone to pay me to do this because it's taking up a lot of my time. So I started applying for various bits of funding and just got rejection after rejection because people just did not understand what I was trying to achieve. And then amazingly, one of my colleagues connected me up with Paul Slavkovskis, who is a professor at Oxford, who was one of the pioneers in CBT in the UK. He's sort of developed therapy models for panic disorder, for health anxiety, for OCD. She said, I think he'll really be into this. And it turned out he was really into this. So he was just really excited that there was something new to work on. And Oxford likes to be ahead of the curve, so they like to support innovative projects. And then I got funding from the Wellcome Trust, who also like to support innovation. So I kind of went from applying for these tiny little grants that no one was interested in to then getting the mother of all grants, which is 3 years fully funded at Oxford by the Wellcome Trust. And so my proposal for that was basically to take what I'd been doing in therapy and to break it down and see if we can work out what the key mechanisms are, what the key aspects that can change with therapy or that could change with therapy. And so over the next 3 years, I'm going to be doing in-depth interviews with people just to really try and understand what's going on for people with misophonia. And then we're going to do lots of experimental stuff. So I'm in the Department of Experimental Psychology, which means we get to, stick things to people and test them and measure them. Yeah, it's amazing. It feels like real science. And I've always been like soft science with psychology and therapy, but this is like proper experiments. So we're sort of in that process now. So it's me and Paul and my colleague Victoria. They're overseeing the sort of research supervision, and we've just
so Paul, this is also part of his full-time. This is kind of, he's very much focused on this, or is he being the pioneer of CBT? He's got his probably many things.
He just drops in once a week and throws his genius
hopefully
all over
without
my
a donut
work.
And,
everyone knows not to have any food in meetings. No, so he's the director of clinical psychology here at Oxford and runs the clinic. So he's my research supervisor. So basically he just oversees and makes sure that what I'm doing is legitimate and makes sense, and he can put it into the context of the many research projects that he's done in the past. So but he's not actually doing research on this himself. He's just supporting my research and sort of helping me to develop my ideas. I'm pretty new to research. I did some research when I was doing my clinical psychology doctorate. I did a big 3-year project then, but then I moved more into the clinical side of things, and then more like developing services and things like that. So I'm kind of returning to research. So it's amazing to have the support of someone who really knows what he's doing with research.
Yeah. Do you see the team expanding over the next 3 years? Like there might be folks listening who are, I know some who are, have recently got out of school. Maybe they're looking for to join a group or somehow get involved.
I hope so. I'm still working with Celia at King's College London, and we have a couple of master's students that we're supervising with misophonia research, and I'm available to supervise master's and doctoral projects here at Oxford as well. If people are coming through psychology departments that want to focus on misophonia, I can at least in part help with that. We're sort of trying to link in with some auditory perception, more like brain type people, because that's definitely not my area of strength, but it's really a key part of misophonia, so I can't ignore it, but I need someone else to help me do that part. So there hopefully will be some collaborations there, and of course my ongoing collaboration with Celia at King's College.
Right. Yeah, sounds like we'll definitely, I would love to have you on more often over the next 3 years and see how things are going. And I think that'd be really interesting. I get, one thing, I guess we should start to wrap it up. But I was curious, couple things. Well, one thing was, we had somebody whose name is, comes up in a lot of Google searches and YouTube searches, Tom Dozier, on the podcast a little while ago. And I heard that maybe you had some communications with him over the past year. I'm curious what you think of some of his approaches to misophonia, real kind of briefly.
Yeah, I appreciate that he may be a divisive figure.
Yes.
I listened to his episode, so I heard you talking to him. So I guess the key thing, so he's very focused on the physical reflex. He's very like behaviorism oriented. I think I agree that for most people there probably is some kind of physical reflex. I just don't think that that's the problem. So I think that the problem is the meaning that we put on either the sounds or on the feeling that we get when we hear the sound. So that might be a physical reflex for some. For other people, it might appear as like an image in their head that makes them think that there's something wrong with them. So you were asking at the very start about links with OCD. So somebody who is more in that OCD kind of territory, if they get an image that they're going to shove a fork in someone's face or something because they're scraping it when they eat, that's what we would call an intrusive thought or an intrusive image. And if you then feel like that means I'm crazy, or that means I really want to, I'm a violent person underneath, or that I really want to do something to harm them, I wouldn't have that image if I didn't want to. That would fit more in the more similar to what we might see in OCD. But we wouldn't consider the image to be the problem. We would consider the fact that you think that image, which is not unusual to have violent images from time to time, but if you think that makes you a bad person, that's then the source of your distress. And so same with the physical reflex. I'm sure that reflex is there because whenever we have some kind of emotional experience, there's a physical sensation that goes along with it. But anything that targets that reflex, you can kind of only do one thing at a time. You can do that sort of gradual counter-conditioning process that he talked about, but that typically doesn't generalize very well to other experiences. Whereas if you focus on the meaning, then if you come out of therapy thinking, I'm not a bad person for having these thoughts, or I'm not going to snap and lose control just because I tense up when I hear a sound, that then will generalize to other sounds. And we can do work on specific sounds, and I do a little bit of counter conditioning type things, a bit different from what Tom does, but sort of playing around with sounds and trying to take control of sounds. So we've got one where you pretend that you're a director directing a film, and the character comes from a troubled background, and so they never learned how to eat properly, and so you sort of take control of the scene, and it just sort of brings down that sense of violation or threat that you get when you hear the eating sounds. So that's another form of counter conditioning that I also use, but I'm focused on changing the meaning that I'm in danger, or I'm going to snap, or I'm going to lose control, or I'm not in control. I'm trying to change that rather than trying to change the reflex,
the mechanics, the physical. Interesting. Okay, now I see the difference between the two. Okay, yeah. So, another question I had before we wrap up. I'm curious. You mentioned you heard the Tom Dozier episode. Have you heard? I don't know how many episodes have you heard, but have you learned anything maybe from people who've been on the podcast, or noticed any kind of themes that maybe either reinforced or would surprise you?
Oh, I am constantly learning. I'm so curious about misophonia. So every time I listen to one of these episodes, every time I read people's comments, I'm in quite a few of the Facebook groups and following people on Instagram, I'm always learning. So I'm really fascinated by patterns. So when I see something that seems like, oh, that's a really unique thing, and then someone else describes the exact same thing, I find that fascinating. But also sometimes someone has a really different experience, and that sort of plays on my mind, and I start looking out
like
for
my lack of internalizing.
Exactly. Right. Yeah, and things like that. So one of the things that Celia and I would like to do in our next research project is to try and see if there are subtypes of misophonia. So in therapy, what I'm noticing is that there are the people who sort of put it all on themselves, like, this is on me, I've got to fix this, and either I'm a bad person, or this is not the real me, and I don't know how to fix that. And then there are people like, this is on other people, and they need to learn to behave better. And that can actually be harder to change because you don't have any control over other people. And so then it's like we might use different strategies for that, for sort of learning to cope and tolerate the world is not exactly how you want it to be. So what we want to do is to see whether there are sort of profiles of misophonia that you might approach differently depending on the sort of subtype.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah. So the podcast has been fascinating for that, because I sort of listen and just sort of keep track of little things, and I just find it so interesting and fascinating. And I always ask the groups whenever I'm starting a little project. I sort of ask for ideas or run things by people. When we were designing the website for the clinic in Oxford, I wanted to write a really good description of misophonia, so I posted it in one of the groups, and they gave loads of feedback, and so I was able to make it absolutely amazing and written in collaboration with the misophonia community, which of course just makes it more representative of what people experience.
Well, we definitely have links to all that in the show notes, and when I post this on social media. I think I want more people to learn about your group. But I guess I should wrap it up here. But
sorry, I love talking about this.
I honestly,
you've given me free access.
The only
thing
that's stopping
me
is I'd happy to give you more. The only thing stopping me is I probably have to get back to my day job. But this has been epic. But I do want to any kind of like at least in this round one, and who knows when round two will be. But is there anything else you kind of want to tell people now about I don't know, your research or misophonia in general?
I think the main thing for people in the UK in particular is that please, if you feel like you really need help for this, then keep asking for help. And if the only way to get that is to you can get referrals to our clinic in Oxford, but you can also just contact our clinic in Oxford to ask for help for how you can get help locally, that it should be available. And if it isn't available, then you can also get referred to our specialist service. And a lot of people haven't heard of it and don't understand it, and that makes it incredibly frustrating in this huge uphill battle to get help. But help is actually available, and the NHS is supposed to provide help for people who are in distress and whose lives are significantly affected by a problem. Even if their GP doesn't understand the problem, you're still supposed to be offered help for it. So if you think that there's a psychological component, if it causes distress, if it has a significant impact on your life, then I encourage you to just keep persisting and contact us at Oxford if you're having trouble getting help, because we can sort of help you find the right terms and maybe provide some information.
Yeah, I love that message. Keep persisting, raise your hand, keep asking for help, because it'll have an impact on you, but it also that also gets the word out for other people too. So you are helping the community at the same time.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, Jane, Dr. Jane Gregory, thanks for coming on. This has been an epic conversation. Yeah, I'm so glad you're doing the work you're doing, and yeah, wish you the best for the next 3 years, and love to talk to you again.
Thank you, and likewise, thank you for the work you're doing. You're making just stories available to everyone, and that there's something so powerful about having that out in the world. So thank you for your work too.
Thank you, Jane. So much to digest from this episode. Please reach out to Jane from her website or social media if you have any questions or feedback. Remember, all her links are in the show notes, but basically look at Sounds Like Misophonia, which is her online misophonia persona. If you liked this episode, please leave a quick review or just hit the 5 stars wherever you listen to this podcast. Music, as always, is by Moby. And until next week, wishing you peace and quiet.